This happened back in 2004 or 2005, when I was about 13. My dad and I were heading out to a rural deer lease outside Uvalde, Texas. The owner had complained about hogs wrecking his land, so my dad thought it'd be a good chance to spend some father-son time and hunt. The drive was long, 7 hours in a cramped Jeep Wrangler. By the time we arrived, the cabin on the land was pretty rough. Dust everywhere, raccoons had gotten in, and it stunk. After a quick cleanup, we settled in for the night, but something about it didn't feel right. I had this weird feeling, like I was being watched. Couldn't sleep much at all. The next morning, we were up early to scout for hog tracks. After walking through the woods for about an hour, we found some rooting in the dirt. We followed the trail into the trees when my dad suddenly stopped, arm out. I looked up and saw someone standing about 50 yards ahead, partly hidden by the trees. It was odd. They were wearing a red ski jacket and pants, totally out of place in Texas summer heat, where it was nearly 100 degrees. My dad called out, "Hey, this is private land!" No response. The figure didn't move, dead still. We got closer, and my dad told me to stay back as he walked around the person. He kept talking to them, asking if they were okay, but they just stood there, facing away, hands in their pockets. Then my dad stopped, standing right in front of the figure, and said, "It's a mannequin." I walked over, and sure enough, it was just a mannequin. But something felt off. The clothes it wore were new, spotless. No signs of being out in the elements for more than a day. That's when the dread hit me, hard. I could tell my dad felt it too. We both sensed something was watching us. Without saying a word, my dad whispered, "We're leaving, right now." He grabbed my hand, pulled his pistol, and we made our way back as fast as we could. We packed up and left immediately. On the way home, my dad called the owner, who promised to check the area later. A week passed, and he called back, saying he found nothing, not even the mannequin, no signs of anyone being there. To this day, I don't know who or what put that mannequin there, but it felt like some kind of trap, and I'm just glad we didn't stick around to find out. I've been in scouting for as long as I can remember. Exploring the woods, campfires, and earning badges had always been part of my life. But there's one experience, one time in the woods that still doesn't sit right with me. It happened a few years ago. I was at a camp with two friends, Amy and Harriet. Harriet was the oldest, Amy a year older than me, and me? I was probably the youngest of the group, but I didn't mind. I was just excited to be out in nature, free to roam. We had this simple task, find a stick, a long, straight one, so we could carve it into a point. The three of us set off into the woods that surrounded the campsite. We weren't worried about getting lost. We were scouts, after all. We were careful to memorize the trees, the direction we were heading. We thought we had everything under control. The woods felt normal at first, peaceful even. Birds chirping, leaves crunching beneath our boots. We'd been walking for about 15 minutes and hadn't found anything suitable, so we decided to turn back. That's when it hit us. Everything around us had changed. The trees were no longer distinct. It was like they had merged together, forming a dense wall that made it impossible to figure out where we'd come from. It didn't make sense. We turned in a full circle, looking for something, anything, familiar. But all we saw were the same trees, the same twisted branches, all blending together like they were playing tricks on our minds. I remember Harriet trying to calm us down, saying we should just keep walking. So that's what we did. We walked in the direction we thought was right. We called out, but the woods just seemed to swallow our voices. As we moved deeper, we stumbled across something odd, a thin, concrete path. It was like a road, but too narrow to be useful for cars. It cut the forest in two, like it wasn't supposed to be there. And next to it was an old abandoned shack. It looked weathered and forgotten, almost like it had been lost to time. None of us had any idea that there was anything like this near the campsite. We hadn't seen anything like it on the way in. But the strangest part? We felt no sense of relief when we found it. It didn't help us at all. It only added to the growing feeling that we didn't belong here. We didn't follow the road. It didn't feel right. Instead, we kept walking. Time seemed to stretch, slow down, speed up. None of it made sense. Our hearts were racing, but our legs kept moving forward, aimlessly. We started to panic. After what felt like hours, we came to another road, one we didn't recognize at all. That's when we saw her, a woman walking down the road. She wore a pink and purple regatta outdoors coat, and we ran up to her, desperate for help. We frantically asked her if she knew the way to our campsite. Her answer was strange. She said she'd never seen us before but pointed in a direction, saying there was another campsite nearby. At that point, we didn't care. We just needed to get out of those woods. So we followed her advice, hoping it would lead us somewhere safe, and it did. Eventually, we stumbled back into our camp, exhausted, confused, but relieved to be out of that forest. But when we told our leader, Ian, what had happened, he just looked at us, confused. We apologized for taking so long, explaining how we'd been walking for hours, but he shook his head and said we'd only been gone for 25 minutes. That didn't make sense. It couldn't be right. Our watches, Harriet's phone, they all said the same thing. We'd been out there for nearly 2 hours. It felt like a punch to the gut. How could we have been gone for so little time when it felt like we were lost in those woods for hours? The woods. They had felt suffocating. Like they were trapping us, messing with our sense of time, bending reality around us. To this day, I can't explain what happened. The forest felt alive, like we had stepped into a place where time didn't work the same. None of us had ever experienced anything like it before, or since. I've heard stories about time warps, places where reality bends, but experiencing it firsthand, it was like being in a dream or a nightmare, where time stretched and snapped back, but you never knew which version was real. That feeling, the crushing claustrophobic sense that the woods had closed in around us, never really went away. Even when we got back to camp, it stayed with me, gnawing at the back of my mind. I don't know if it was paranormal, or if the forest was just playing tricks on us. But one thing's for sure, we weren't just lost in those woods. Time itself seemed to lose track of us. And even now I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if we hadn't made it back? What if we'd stayed in that place, lost between minutes and hours, forever? Every year, me and my best friend head out camping. We've been doing this since we were 13. The woods always felt like home, calm, safe. We'd seen all kinds of things, but nothing ever really scared us. Until last year, in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It started like every other trip. We arrived during peak season, so campsites were scarce. We set up on the side of a mountain, battling the wind as night came fast. The next morning we went into town, grabbed some beers, hung out, just messing around. By the time we got back to find a new campsite, the light was fading again. We found a more remote spot, set up our tents, and got a fire going. We settled in with some drinks, just like we always did. It was around 1 a.m. when we saw it. Someone's flashlight, aimed right at us. At first we thought it was a park ranger coming to check on us. Who else would be wandering around this deep in the mountains at this hour? Unspoken camping rule. You don't just walk up on people in the middle of the night, not unless it's an emergency. The flashlight kept coming closer, and then we saw them. A man in his 50s, wearing a t-shirt and basketball shorts, with a woman who wouldn't even make eye contact with us. She stayed in the shadows, eyes down, like she didn't want to be there. The man started talking, forcing this awkward conversation about nothing. He rambled on about our lantern, asking what kind it was, acting like it was the coolest thing he'd ever seen. His eyes? They were everywhere, darting around like he was scanning us. The ground, our tents. The whole time his flashlight moved with his eyes, sweeping over everything. He never once acknowledged the time or the strangeness of the situation. He mentioned being former law enforcement, but it felt off. There was no context, no reason for him to tell us that. He kept glancing at our setup, then suddenly flashed his light on our tents and said, "Oh, that's where you guys are sleeping? Nice setup." That's when it hit us. He wasn't just looking at our gear, he was sizing us up, checking out what we had, how many of us were there, if we were alone. It was subtle, but clear. After what felt like forever, he stopped talking, paused for a moment, and then, just like that, he turned and walked off into the woods, disappearing into the night with his flashlight. As soon as his light vanished, my friend looked at me, dead serious, and said, "We're packing up, now." We didn't need to talk about it. We both felt it. That guy wasn't just passing through. He was going to come back, and whatever he had in mind wasn't good. We packed up in record time, throwing everything into the car, adrenaline surging through us. The woods around us felt darker, colder. The silence weighed heavy, like the mountain was watching. By the time we drove away, neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. That was the most unsettling moment I've ever experienced in the wild. I don't know what that man was planning, but I'm certain of one thing. We were getting sized up that night for something bad. Sometimes it's not the wilderness you need to fear. It's the people who wander into it.